want to thank our sponsors, Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. Also want to thank Eight Cousins Bookseller because, as you know, all our books are available there. And we also should have some book plates for this one as well. There was some that was supposed to be sent to Eight Cousins, so want to make sure that you know about that. I also want to make sure I thank someone before we get started tonight. I want to thank Mary Fran Buckley from Eight Cousins because she was the most insistent that we have to get this woman named Casey Sepp. Mark, you got to check this book out. She showed it to me. She told me the plot. She pretty much had me at hello, but she wasn't going to stop until I made sure that Casey Sepp came to Falmouth. And Casey Sepp really wanted to come to Falmouth, but unfortunately, because of COVID, she's like us, she's at home. And Casey Sepp is a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine. This is her first book, Furious Hours. She got her bachelor's from Harvard. She got her master's from Oxford. So looks like another one who couldn't get into the University of Illinois, but I guess she was able to make do at Harvard. So without further ado, would you welcome Casey Sepp?
Thanks so much. It's true. I had the chance, actually, before my book came out, to meet Mary Fran Buckley, and I assume that she's well known in the community, but what a gift to authors and book lovers. She was such an enthusiast that were coming out that year and really thoughtfully concerned about what folks in her community might like to read. And I wish that I could have been there in person, but it's nice to be able to gather at least like this. And I'll take some time at the beginning to tell you a bit about the book in case you haven't read it or in case you haven't heard anything about it. And I think tonight that I often spend all of my time talking about the three main characters in my book. And it's certainly true that it's a character-driven story. So obviously the most famous of those characters is Harper Lee, one of the most beloved novelists in American history, in global literary history. But there are two other equally interesting characters, and one is the serial killer who was accused of killing 5 family members in the 1970s, and the second is his lawyer who defended him through all of the criminal and civil litigation that resulted from those accusations. So normally I just end up talking about those three, but inevitably the questions that I get from the audience mostly have to do with me and how I found the story and how I reported the story and how a book like this comes together. So I thought for a change of pace tonight, I would focus on the story of how I figured out Harper Lee had ever worked on this true crime project, how I got to know some of the surviving family members in the book. And I think because, we're here under the auspices of the Museums on the Green, just talk a little bit about local history and how it's preserved and how it comes together and how useful it is for someone like me when I take an interest in a story to be able to tap into existing networks of local librarians, local genealogists, people who have been doing the hard work of making sure that what happens every day that makes it into the newspaper or even things that don't are preserved, and that there is an archival history and a material cultural history so that historians and journalists in the future can write about these things. So I think I'll just skip there because you can read the book, and the book is everything I know about Harper Lee and the Reverend Willie Maxwell and the lawyer Tom Radney. But I'll try to bring the book to life because I think some of you have already read it, and I do think that here we are behind our computers. One of the things I can do is at least make everything a little more lively. So the first story that I think I'll tell, so basically I'm going to walk you through 5 of the kind of critical reporting moments for me that, brought the book into being and that shaped the direction it took. And the first one, like a lot of great ideas, Furious Hours began with a phone call. And I had been sent down to Alabama by the New Yorker to write about Harper Lee and her novel Go Set a Watchman, which maybe some of you all remember back in 2015, after many decades of saying she would never publish another book, suddenly Harper Lee's publisher announced here was this novel. And, you know, it was a global event. People wanted to know, had she written it? When did she write it? You know, why was it just coming out now? There were so many questions about the novel in particular and about her life and about, you know, the people who were overseeing her affairs, because her older sister, who had been her business manager and financial guardian for her entire literary career, had just passed away, and someone new had taken over her affairs. So there were a lot of questions about whether this book was legitimate, whether Harper Lee legitimately wanted it published, and what was going on in her life. So I went down to Monroeville, the tiny town where Harper Lee was born and raised, and I was working on that story. You know, what was Go Set a Watchman? Who was Tanya Carter, Harper Lee's lawyer? And what the heck was going on with Harper Lee? And in the course of reporting that, you know, I asked people in town. This is a small town, probably exactly like some on the Cape, and, you know, exactly like every other state in the Union, small town where, you know, you start asking questions and people direct you to so-and-so's second cousin, or, you know, somebody's ex-best friend who went to Sunday school together when they were kids. And so I really did just say I wanted to talk to anyone who knew anything about Harper Lee or anything about her lawyer. And one of the things that happened about I guess it was like 5 or 6 days into that, I got put in touch with a young woman who lived in Tuscaloosa. And that young woman's name was Marilyn. And her grandfather was Tom, the lawyer in my book. And she had tried to get back some of her granddad's files a few years before. Her grandfather had passed away. They were going through his affairs, clearing out his estate. And they knew that way back in the 1970s, he had given Harper Lee some materials. And he never got them back. And there was always this question of, had she thrown them out? Did she keep them? Whatever happened to them? And so Tom Radney's oldest granddaughter, this little girl named Madeline, had tried to get in touch with Harper Lee. And she got a letter back from Harper Lee's lawyer who said, you know, Harper Lee has no memory of your grandfather. She never had these files. I can't help you. And that had struck Madeline as strange because for several years, Harper Lee and her grandfather had had a correspondence. Her mother, who's one of Tom Radney's children, remembered meeting Harper Lee, getting a book signed, having her over for dinner. People around town had talked about Harper Lee's connection to the community so much that little Madeline thought, well, that's all very strange. It can't possibly be true. So then she had tried to get in touch with Harper Lee's lawyer and it hadn't gone well. And anyway, she's telling me this whole story. And, you know, it was like a lot of the people I got put in touch with that week, I was making notes, you know, they first made contact in this year and that. And, you know, I'm sitting there with my notepad and I said, well, why was Harper Lee in town? How did she know your grandfather? And she started in on the story of the Reverend Maxwell. And I sometimes joke that you've got to be a pretty bad reporter when somebody on the phone starts talking about the voodoo serial killing preacher who murdered 5 family members for the life insurance, who was gunned down at the funeral of his last victim. And your grandfather defended both the serial killer and the guy who shot him. You know, it was just crazy. And I said, you know, just tell me everything about that. And then so she tells me the whole story. And beyond that case, her grandfather had had a very political career. He had been, you know, a Kennedy liberal during the Wallace years of Alabama's history, and he'd served in the state legislature. He'd run for lieutenant governor. He'd continued to advocate publicly for democratic politics, even when the two parties parted ways on civil rights. And so she was telling me all this, and it was just wildly interesting. You know, Tom Radney was a guy, he went by Big Tom. You know, he was truly just a big man in town. And I'm sure, again, wherever you're from, there's a Big Tom where you live. And it's someone who's in the Masons, in the Lions Club, in the Elks Lodge. He does it all. You've met him. You've heard about him at every bar mitzvah, every funeral, every wedding. And, you know, so her grandfather was just very interesting. And by the time she got to the end of his life career, I'd kind of forgotten why we were on the phone, which was Harper Lee. And I said, you know, but what about Harper Lee? And she says, well, Harper Lee was going to write a book about all this. And she moved to town. And, you know, I don't know why she doesn't remember, but she moved to town. She took all these notes. She did all these interviews. And we just want my grandfather's things back. So, you know, it was truly the strangest story anybody told me when I was in Alabama. And I wanted to include it in the piece I wrote for the New Yorker, but it was like 3,000 words. It was already kind of long. There were a lot of other things going on in Harper Lee's life, some litigation, some financial irregularities, and the big question of Watchmen, so it didn't make it in. But I said to my editor like a week or two later, I've got to write about this Harper Lee true crime thing. It's so fascinating. Nobody knows anything about it. I knew she had helped Capote with In Cold Blood, so I knew there were all these other kind of connections between her work on this case and her career as a writer. And, my editor finally said, Uncle, go write the thing you want to write and we'll put it on the website. So I wrote that article, and in the course of reporting that, there was a second phone call. And, I told you, so little Madeline, Tom's granddaughter, that's the origin story, that first phone call and that long story. And, the conversations we had after that, and the family started to share their documents and their archives and everything they had about Tom's career. But, it still felt kind of too good to be true. And the story itself felt, too crazy to be true. So one of the things that happened when I was working on the next New Yorker story was I got a phone call. I'd been trying to track down a young reporter named Jim Earnhardt. And Jim is a very mild-mannered, polite Southern boy. And he was very, very young when all this happened. He was the only reporter there the day that the Reverend Maxwell was shot. There was five family members of the Reverend who were dead in suspicious circumstance, on whom he held all these life insurance policies. And the last of those was a 16-year-old stepdaughter. And her murder just shocked everyone in this community who thought they couldn't be shocked any more than they had. She was 16, she was very well liked. There was really, no logical explanation what had happened to her, and the scene of her murder was identical to the crime scenes of the earlier crimes. It was staged to look like a car accident, but not even convincingly so. And so the police were really, quite sure once again it was the Reverend, but around this part of Alabama, no one thought he would be convicted because he never had been before. And he had managed to get life insurance policy after life insurance policy, and understandably, the feeling in the community was he's going to get away with this again. So at her funeral, that 16-year-old's funeral, another relative of hers stood up, fired a Beretta pistol 3 times, shot the Reverend in cold blood, and murdered him in front of 300 people at the funeral. And one of the people who was there was this reporter, Jim Earnhardt. So I get on the phone with Jim, and we're talking about what happened. And, I said, gosh, it seems like maybe this all got kind of exaggerated. Like, it's kind of hard to believe there was this murder in a funeral chapel. And he says, no, I was there. And, he digs up his first person account of it. And, as soon as he left, he went right to his typewriter, typed it all up. And so there was Jim, it really happened. And here's the article proving it. And let me put you in touch with some other people who were alive at that time. Let me help you track down some of the Reverend's family members and people who knew him. Let me help you piece together the story, because it really did happen. And it's true. Every word of it is true. So Jim was a really determinative call, because when you're a reporter and you're trying to figure things out, you're often, looking for unbiased sources, which there's no truly unbiased source, but somebody who's a reporter who was just there covering the crime is useful to talk to and trustworthy, realize recollection at the time away. So it's not just, what he remembers. It's not 40 years later what he scratches his head and can put together. So that was another moment of finding Jim. And the coincidence of Jim, it was literally his first year on the job. He was really young. So in terms of, reporting a story out from the 1970s, Jim was useful for 2 reasons. He had this whole body of kind of first person experience. He was also young enough to remember it and to piece it together convincingly. And he had never left this part of Alabama. So like Tom Brady's family, he was connected to a lot of the people in the story, and he had continued to live there. So that was all and good. It felt like the Maxwell case side of things was coming together. But like a lot of reporters, I was having trouble with the Harper Lee side of things. Because if there's anything any of you know about Harper Lee, it's that she was pathologically private. She never talked to the press. She wouldn't do interviews. She never talked about anything. And that was, for my first week or 2 in Alabama, true. The people who talked to me knew nothing about Harper Lee. And the people who wouldn't talk to me were her close relatives and friends. And so you were always, at the mercy of what you could get second or third hand from one of those people who'd actually seen her recently or who'd actually known her. And I think the best reporting story on the side of Harper Lee is, once I was digging into the book, someone in New York City said to me, I know someone who knows Harper Lee. She was her next door neighbor for 30 years. and you seem really nice. I can't promise anything, but I'll get you an introduction. And so I thought, all right, let's see how it goes, which some of you might already be thinking, well, why was she living in New York? And I think one of the most surprising things about Harper Lee is that for all of her deep connections to Alabama and her lifelong, visits to the state, she was actually a Manhattanite through and through. She moved there in her 1920s. She spent much of her adult life there. That is where she had most of her friendships, professional and personal, and where she just loved to be. She was going to Mets games. She was going to the Met to take a tour of the latest exhibition. She loved going to the Frick. She had her local coffee shop just like anybody else who lives in Manhattan. So this friend of Harper Lee's, who had known her for 30 years, lived across the street from her in this neighborhood of Yorkville. So I knew the building she had lived in, and I had been writing these cold letters to everybody who had lived there over the last 40 years, begging them to tell me anything. How many bags of garbage did she bring out every week? What newspapers did she read? Anything they could remember. But here was this woman who was actually a close friend. So I live in Maryland, but I went up to New York, and I had a couple of other research things to do. Like, the Columbia University has some archives with Harper Lee's letters, and I wanted to go to the New York Public Library to look at her reporting from when she was out in Kansas with Capote. And so I had a couple of other things on my list where I thought, even if this trip is a bust, I'll go and get that archival stuff done. But I knock on the door of this elderly woman's apartment, and wonderful woman named Sylvia Schwartz, and right away I sit down, and she says to me, the friend who had put us in touch, she says, he says, you're trustworthy, not going to write anything sensational, so get out your tape recorder. And, again, it's these reporting moments, you never know how they're going to go. You never know. There are some people in the book who only ended up talking to me after 2 years of begging and pleading and, sending them polite emails. And, but here was this woman, she opens the door and right away just starts talking. And in fact, she and her husband had been good friends of Harper Lee to the point that, she came over for dinner and they'd go to Chinese every week, and she helped with childcare for their son. And it was just a deep friendship. And this woman, kind of point by point, just talks me through all the years of their relationship and things she thought about her mental health, stories. Some just wonderful about Harper Lee's erudition or her appetite for the theater or her delight in, Manhattan culture, but some of them hard. Some of the stories that are in the book about Harper Lee's struggles with alcohol or with depression. So those are the kinds of stories that come out of those 30-year friendships where this woman had not previously acknowledged she was a friend of Harper Lee's, much less laid out the terms of their friendship. And so that was all going perfectly well enough already. But at the end of it, we talked for maybe 2.5 hours, and good time, great stories. I've got the tape recorder going the whole time. And finally, I asked what I often asked in those interviews, at the very end, I just said, well, did you happen to save any letters? And Harper Lee's letters are truly, the kind of coin of the realm of literary biography. Like, you have to have these kinds of letters to piece together a writer's life, especially, but really any public figure. And there had not been many of them released to the public. People hoarded them, people kept them private, people didn't want to share her private life while she was alive because she policed it so severely. And so this woman says to me, oh yeah, I've already gathered them, and if the conversation went well, I was going to give them to you. And sure enough, she hands over 30 years worth of letters. And I'm like looking at my watch like, well, I can't keep this octogenarian at the table for as long as it takes me to like read every one of these and make my notes. And she must have made in my mind, because she said, oh, there's a Kinko's a couple blocks away, you should just go photocopy them and then bring them back. Which, again, like, the number of reporting days that did not go that well, the number of times somebody slams the phone or hurries you out the door or says something tantalizing like, I have Harper Lee letters, but I won't share them. A Sylvia Schwartz day, I quote from the letters in the book. There's some really amazing stories of New York. There's a very funny letter I quote where Harper Lee has had a nightmare that she's been evicted, but she says, she's not that worried about it because all that ended up on the curb was, a broken typewriter, a dilapidated bed, and a bunch of books. So we just get a sense of her New York life, and it's only thanks to those letters. And so I think there are a bunch of other days that worked like that, where again, stories from family or letters that her nephews or her niece, but only after a long courtship and long discussion about how they would work in the book and what other information I had. And, you know, just the kinds of discussions that go into a project like this. You know, what else have you found? Who else has shared them? And managing the expectations of privacy and respect that subjects have. You know, often you're writing about people's family members and it's the first time they've spoken publicly about them. So, you know, one version of that is Harper Lee. You can imagine if you are related to the Reverend Willie Maxwell, and, you know, the thing that is known about your relative to the world is that he was a serial killer, supposedly, or a voodoo priest, maybe, you are understandably reticent to talk to the press, to open up about anything personal or private, to share any kind of family documents. So I think, you know, the three characters in the book were hard to report for different reasons, but I love that story of Sylvia Schwartz because the other thing is, books like this come together when people are archivists of their own experience. So what Sylvia had done over the years was keep her letters, you know, keep the envelopes so she knew the years and the postmarks and organize them chronologically. And she wasn't just going to hand them over to anyone, but she was ready to hand them over to someone. And I think, you know, even if it's not a famous friendship, I do think places like Museums on the Green or any number of historical societies or the archives of universities or colleges only function when we tend to our own history and our own experiences. And, you know, I could never have written this book if people hadn't saved letters from Tom Radney or Harper Lee, or if they hadn't saved their newspaper clippings, because in some instances, the newspaper archives are incomplete. You know, you go to the state archives or you pull up the microfilm and for whatever reason it's deleted or it's lost and you don't have the full run of something. So the idea that we would all take an interest, and I don't mean that you have to become like scrapbookers extraordinaire, but, you know, just that you would take time with your life. And I think it's a great time for that. I often end up talking about newspapers.com or ancestry.com, these digital tools that are allowing huge swaths of global history to be accessible remotely and electronically. And they're a real gift for researchers, but, you know, they only work when we contribute new material or when we piece together connections between existing material. And I try, you know, often I lift up those tools, but I want to share one story that is, you know, kind of outside that sphere, because if it were all easy and you could just call it up with, you know, a keystroke or just search on the internet for like Harper Lee Maxwell case, you are able to write a book when you go beyond what's known. And I think probably the best example of that is the court reporter in this book, which if you have the book, there are some great photos in the book, and you can see the Reverend, you can see pictures of Harper Lee when she was young, when she was old, with her family. But there's one photograph is my favorite in the book, and it's a personal check. And if you have the book in front of you, it's the check. It says, you know, Nell Harper Lee, or Alice Lee, because I told you her older sister was her business manager and financial advisor. So it's a joint account. And it's a check for $1,000 written in 1978, which was, you know, not an insignificant amount. But there's the most thorough memo line in the history of memo lines. And it says, you know, transcript of record in the case of Robert Louis Burns, you know, state of Alabama v. Robert Louis Burns. And that case is the trial of the vigilante. So the man who shot the Reverend Maxwell, 300 people, was obviously tried for that murder. And the second section of the book takes you through that trial, how it happened, how the jury decided its verdict, and tells you what it was like for Harper Lee when she met the story, because she came to Alabama in order to sit through that trial. And she introduced herself. She was not, you know, recognizable. The prologue of my book begins with this kind of surprising claim that in the 1970s, 17 years after To Kill a Mockingbird, no one recognized Harper Lee. You know, her author photo was almost 2 decades out of date. She had not done publicity. So even in Alabama, probably the place where she was most famous, she could walk into a courtroom and no one would recognize her. But one by one, she started to introduce herself to people in this part of Alabama, to the lawyers, to the judge. She got to know some of the jury members, you know, to people in the courtroom audience who were connected to the case, some of the expert witnesses, all of the people, if you're a crime reporter, who you would talk to write your own book. That's exactly the work that Harper Lee was doing. And one of the people she introduced herself to was the court reporter. There's a woman named Marianne Carr. So the check that you'll see if you get the book is made out to Marianne Carr. And I tell you the story of Marianne Carr only because, again, it shows you the limits of what people remember and the limits of what's known about any given episode of history. Marianne Carr, I had been told, was long dead. You know, oh, when I said, is the judge alive? He was deceased, so I interviewed his widow. And when I said, you know, is the court reporter alive? And I was assured she was dead. I couldn't talk to her. Don't worry about it. You know, she was just a court reporter anyway. And I thought about it at some point. I was like maybe a year into working on the book, and I thought, you know, I never found her obituary. It's odd if she lived in this part of Alabama her whole life that there was no obituary when she died. So I went to the, you know, public records for phone records, and sure enough, here there were 3 Marianne Carrs. And the very first one on the list, when I go and knock on the door, says right away, yes, I was a court reporter in this circuit of the Alabama Circuit Court for 40 years. What do you want to know? And she's in her bathrobe, but she took me into the kitchen, sat me down, and she told me about the judge she had worked for, how court reporting worked, and of course, she started to tell me about the Maxwell case. And when she gets into the Maxwell case, you know, she says to me, I haven't really talked about this since I talked to Harper Lee about it. And I sat up in my chair and said, you know, I would really like to know about that. You know, when did you talk to Harper Lee? And she tells me the story. Harper Lee introduced herself, coming back for bologna cheese sandwiches, meeting the woman's husband, and sure enough, writing her the check, you know, promising her $1,000 if she would prepare the transcript. And, you know, it's just one of those stories. I was interested enough. The woman said, let me show you the check. And she went to her bureau, which, God bless her granddaughter, who had laminated the check. You know, she had gotten the canceled check back from the bank and then kept it. And one of her grandkids laminated it because so many people had ogled it and handled it over the years. And that's how that check, you know, preserved by the court reporter to whom it was made out, made it into my book. And, you know, once again, you know, you talk to this person for a couple of hours and she populates that trial, the courthouse, the world as Harper Lee encountered it in this part of Alabama. So I love that story because there's a universe in which I just took someone else's word. Oh, she's dead. Don't worry about it. The check, the story of their meeting, all of that just slips away. Because often the things that happen in history, you know, maybe Harper Lee would have written about it in a letter you could find, but maybe not. You know, from Harper Lee's perspective, she met people all day and all night. From this woman's perspective, their meeting and their lunch and that check was one of the most extraordinary things that had ever happened to her. So I love that story because it is just the persistence of when you are investigating something, you know, whether you are a reporter like I am, you know, if you're doing it for a magazine or a newspaper, or if you're just doing it because you're interested in your own family's history, you know, you have to make sure that the things you're told are true. And some of the most fortuitous opportunities come from tracking down the person who no one else has been able to. You know, that part of the story that's left out of the book. There had been a biography of Harper Lee published about 10 years before I got interested in the Maxwell case. And the Maxwell case, which is, you know, my whole book, is 2.5 pages, a tiny, tiny sliver. And, you know, the 2.5 pages that opens into a book like this, all the characters, all the time Harper Lee spent there, all the new letters and manuscript materials that emerge, there's just so much more to any given story. And, you know, you've probably seen that if your life has ever been covered in the newspaper. You know, maybe there was like a tiny notice that your parents had their 50th wedding anniversary. But maybe you were at that party and you know it was a raucously good time where like the former mayor gave an embarrassing speech about what their childhood was like, or, you know, somebody they went to temple with told some incredible story about who they were. And those are the kinds of things that even when the newspaper covers it, don't get reported. So I love Marianne Carr, not only because the check is just such a welcome object in the book, but the story of how I found her feels to me like the kinds of stories that make life interesting as a reporter. And, you know, the embodiment of history and individual actors is for me the fun part. You know, again, if it were easy, if it were all just written down, we would sit at our computers all day and never leave. We would never have to pick up the phone. We would never have to go knock on someone's door. So the reluctant participants and the kind of forgotten actors of a historical event are the people who are most interesting to me. And, you know, it can happen even to people who are kind of famous. There's a woman at the very beginning of the Harper Lee chapter of this book who, for complicated reasons, because her husband died in office, became the second female senator from Alabama, a woman named Marianne Pittman Allen. And, you know, Marianne Pittman Allen just slotted right into my book because when I tracked her down, she told me a story she hadn't told before about getting Harper Lee to sign a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird for Mr. and Mrs. Carter. So she needed a gift for the First Lady. It was supposed to be a book representative of her home state. And lo and behold, she's got a friend of a friend who knows Harper Lee, and she gets Harper Lee on the phone. And for the purposes of my book, what's remarkable, the real coincidence is Harper Lee was in Alexander City working on her voodoo preacher story. And that's what she tells Senator Marianne Pittman Allen, who never forgot it. So those are, I think, you know, the kinds of like run of the mill, you know, this happens all the time when you're a reporter. You find someone you think is dead who's not, or somebody's granddaughter, you know, tells you the story they've been waiting to tell for a long time. And, you know, those kinds of things feel pretty run of the mill. But the last story that I want to share is the epilogue of my book. And it's much more rare, I think, unless you do kind of like corporate espionage reporting or, you know, true political intrigue that this sort of thing happens. But probably the most exciting day of working on my book was the day that Tom Radney's daughter called and said that she wanted to know, was I at home and how was I doing? Very polite. And then wanted to know if I wanted to come to Alabama to get a briefcase. And, you know, it doesn't sound like the most exciting offer, but it turned out that she had heard from Harper Lee's estate, it was after Harper Lee had died, and a briefcase of Tom Radney's had been found among Harper Lee's things. And the estate was relinquishing it to Tom Radney's heirs. So, you know, again, I see the skepticism in your little Zoom windows where you're like, so what, a dusty briefcase, what was it? And again, remember that at this point, Harper Lee said nothing. You know, the friends of Harper Lee would surrender nothing. You know, nothing was known about her estate because of all these questions, the controversy of Watchmen and all of the millions of dollars that were unaccounted for, that were being made with decisions contrary to her wishes. And so here was the surprising return of this briefcase. So I go down to Alabama and we get it and pick it up at the Lee family law firm right in Monroeville and start going through it page by page. And not only was it all of Tom Radney's legal materials, so all of the life insurance cases where he had represented the Reverend, you know, this guy in the 1970s had made $500,000 in life insurance money, a tremendous amount of money. So all of the litigation on the civil side of things, suing the life insurance companies, getting them to pay out, all of the private autopsies, all of that material, you know, other court transcripts, all kinds of filings, intake forms, you know, because again, these were criminal investigations and the Reverend was accused in all of them and he was investigated in all of them. And in one of them, you know, he had been accused with an accomplice. And so for Harper Lee, this was all the information about the alleged accomplice, which if you've read the book, you know, I quote this letter where Harper Lee in the 1980s is telling someone about how her true crime book is going. And she said to Gregory Peck, one letter that's terrified of getting sued. And in this other letter, she says that she's afraid of the living accomplice of the Reverend. So, you know, she knows all that because of Tom Radney's files. So she's got all that. But there's also some more of her work on the case, you know, maps, photocopies of historical documents, some of the actual death certificates she acquired, some of the correspondence she received. And for my purposes, probably the most fascinating document in that briefcase was a page of notes where it's 1978. Harper Lee is conducting herself exactly as she did. If you've seen Capote or Infamous, these two films about the writing of In Cold Blood, then you remember Harper Lee sitting down every night at the hotel to type up her notes, you know, write at her typewriter. There was Truman Capote couldn't be bothered to do it and he claimed he had a perfect memory so he didn't need to, but there was Harper Lee every day. You know, we interviewed this person, we went to this place, here's what it looked like, here's what it said. She did the exact same thing in Alexander City, Alabama. And so here in the briefcase was a page of notes. She was interviewing Reverend Maxwell's first wife. So if you can believe it, he was accused of killing his first wife, a brother, a nephew, a second wife, and then his stepdaughter. So Harper Lee is interviewing a surviving sister of that first murder victim, the first Mrs. Maxwell. And she tells you what date it was. She tells you she's in Mary Lou Maxwell's house. Mary Lou Maxwell's sister tells her everything about the theory of the crime, why they think the Reverend did it, why they were scared he might have killed his nephew too. All the information, it's Harper Lee dutifully typing it up. So I love that page of notes because it really does show you the symmetry of what she was doing in Alexander City and what she had already done in Kansas. So, it's truly just a fun day as a reporter. Like, do you want to go get a briefcase? Again, it's like James Bond. Of course, the answer is you want to go get the briefcase. You want to look at every single document in it. And it's just one of the ways that the book came together, because you get this whole new body of material that tells you everything she was doing, everything she was up to. And in addition to the correspondence, fills out the time she spent on this. Because again, I think that an interesting thing about Harper Lee, she was never not ambitious. She was never not writing. And this True Crime Project just represents one span of time where she spent 9 months in this town. She moved there. She got a motel room for part of the time. She lived in a cabin on the lake for part of the time. And she spent 9 months interviewing people, getting the documents, doing everything I did to write my book. But then the number of years after that where she was working on the project, that to me is the really interesting thing. How much ambition and how much effort she brought to the case. And I think that's why, there's a straightforward mystery in my book of, whether or not she wrote her book, which she was calling The Reverend, this true crime story, whether or not she wrote it. And then there are all these kind of secondary, tertiary, quaternary mysteries that follow from that, which is, well, however much she wrote, what did she do with it? And however much she wrote, why didn't she publish it? And when she quit, why did she quit? And I think that that's where the story gets this kind of parallel emotion to it, where it's not just that Harper Lee never published another book, which is what we all know coming in. It's a question of why, and why was it hard for her, and what did she do with her time, and why wasn't she able to fulfill her ambition? And so that, to me, when you start to try to answer what feels like an emotional question, you can make use of archives, you can make use of letters, you can go and interview 1 million people to ask them the question, but the mystery will always be there, because what I couldn't do is ask Harper Lee. And I think in some really interesting ways, she was the kind of writer who found it hard even to speak of self-knowledge. So I think, one of her nephews told me once, when I was really pressing him on this question of why couldn't she write, and, again, he talked me through all of the kind of psychological problems she had and emotional problems she had. But I think it was just, to me, the most fascinating part of his answer was the deep, deep conviction that, if she knew, she would have fixed it. If she knew what was wrong, she would have known how to fix it. But even for her, it was elusive. That she had the experience of having had a tremendous amount of success and worrying if she would ever have it again. She knew that she had a drinking problem, and at a certain point in her life was able to fix it. She knew that she suffered from depression, and she didn't avail herself of the kind of normal things most of us would, therapy, maybe mood stabilizers, anything like that. Even the things she understood about herself, she was not able to put together her own answer to the question of why not. And I think that's just really moving to me, because it does marry some of the other mysteries of the book, which is, if you're Tom Radney and you know that equality is best for your state, why can't you convince your neighbors of that? And, the Reverend Maxwell, if you are an entrepreneurial, ambitious man, why are you not able to act on those ambitions? Why do you resort to murder? Why does your actual entrepreneurial nature not exercise itself in a small business or some other kind of opportunity? It's channeled into this financial fraud. So I think for all three of them, there are questions, we can piece together the plot of their lives and make use of all the kind of local history materials to do that. But for me, the reason the book was so much fun, and the reason I can, talk about it in small groups and library events and bookstore events, is people always see something else in the story, or they have some other experience that illuminates the lives of the main characters. And, sometimes that's straightforwardly, I do these events and someone like at the end stands up and they have a letter from Harper Lee. That happened to me once at an event in Vermont. Or sometimes someone stands up and says, I live in New York City now, but I actually grew up in Alexander City, and I went to school with Shirley Ann Ellington, and I remember all of this. That's the Reverend stepdaughter. So sometimes people have direct knowledge, but often they just have secondary knowledge, or they ask a question that deepens some part of the story for me. So I just like that it never ends. I mean, that is why we have museums. It's why we gather to talk about books like Mockingbird, even though we've already read them 5 times and they've been in the world for 50 years. There is always something new to see, and there's always something new to understand. So I love to talk about the book, and I hope that, you know, the stories about reporting it kind of brought to life some of the characters too. Obviously, you hear in there some aspects of Harper Lee's life and some aspects of Tom Radney's and some aspects of the Reverend Maxwell. But you got access to the character who I think is most elusive in the book, which is me. There is no I except for the epilogue. You know, you see my notes and my annotations and the bibliography of what I read and who I talked to and the documents I'm drawing on. But I think unlike a lot of narrative nonfiction now, I felt like the most important writer in the book was Harper Lee, and you didn't need those stories about me. But I gave you some tonight. I mean, the truth is, it is really fun to talk about. It was a fun book to report, and, you know, the midnight Full House sessions, or, you know, skulking around in the basement of the Rockford County Courthouse, or going with people to the reverend's grave at midnight to see if he really did come back as a ghost. Like, there are a lot of fun things that aren't in the book, and I love to talk about. But having done that, I want to leave time for questions, because I'm sure that there are some about the history and about the geography and about the characters themselves. So that was kind of the reverse order, because normally I give you the heavy stuff and do all this in the questions, but I wanted to start, just for a change of pace, with the kind of who's Casey Sepp. You know, she's from Maryland. How the heck did she end up in Alabama? Why was she writing about Harper Lee version of events? So I hope that's fun, whether or not you've read the book. If you've read it, you got the kind of backstory, you know, the how-to. And if you haven't, hopefully that sounds interesting and thorough enough that you think, well, maybe there is something to learn about Harper Lee from this book.
Thank you, Casey. That was awesome. If you got a question, use the chat feature down at the bottom. For those of you who have done these before, you know the format. So you go down to Alabama to write about Harper Lee reporting on a case. Did you know anything about the case prior to this? Was this news to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So I had read this biography that had come out of Harper Lee called Mockingbird. It's by a professional biographer. And like I said, there was like this little sliver, like 2 pages of, oh, at one point in time, she was interested in this case and she did some work on it. But it's just a very kind of throwaway moment. So I think because of the way the biography experienced it, I thought, oh, she got interested and then she moved on. And what was immediately clear to me from those initial reporting conversations is it was a much more substantial investment. You know, she had been there for 9 months. You know, there was correspondence of hers all the way into the late 80s where she was talking about the case. I think when I turned up the letters to Gregory Peck, where she tells him, you know, he should be excited because she's going to have another role for him soon, it's just clear that this project was a lot more than had ever been understood. And that the kind of the incongruity between what we all thought about Harper Lee and what the people of Alexander City thought was just remarkable. I mean, so remarkable that when Ghost Had a Watchman was announced, there's probably no reason folks remember this, but what was said first was there's a new book from Harper Lee. And that was all anybody knew. And, you know, the people in Alexander City all thought, obviously, the new book from Harper Lee was the Reverend. You know, they had met her when she was in town working. They had, you know, had her over for supper. They had talked about their careers. They had given her documentation. They had stayed in touch. You know, Jim Earnhardt, that reporter I mentioned, had gone to visit her in New York. She had come to dinner with his parents. She had made all of these friendships and just convinced people that, you know, the book was imminent at any moment. So for the people of Alexander City, they thought the new book had to be the Reverend. And, you know, of course it wasn't. It was Ghost Had a Watchman. So the little bit I knew about the case was nothing compared to what was immediately made clear to me, which was it was a substantial effort. There was probably a lot more to say about her time in town and about her interest in nonfiction and the other kinds of reportage she had done. So I think that is really why I love it. It's like, you know, you go into a museum and you read like one tiny caption and then the caption becomes your dissertation. Or, you know, there's like a footnote in a book somewhere, and then you realize the footnote is worth exploring. And I love it because it is just an example of a life that opened up. And this period, which had been kind of marginalized, was actually really interesting and gave us a lot of information about her life after To Kill a Mockingbird, which had been the most mysterious part of it.
How frustrating, tantalizing, invigorating is it for you as an investigative reporter to try to investigate someone that people didn't want to talk about or was so reluctant to talk about herself that this had to take some ultra digging?
Yeah, I think that's a fine question. And the truth is, I really love, you know, reporting for me as a kind of wild goose chase, or, you know, a fishing expedition. And the harder, the more exciting. You know, again, I just think if it were easy, someone else would have already done it. So the fact that she was so private, the fact that it was hard to learn about her life, made every single successful day that much more exciting. Or, you know, you could write about someone like, who's an example of a writer where there's just like voluminous correspondence. If you were to write about, say, Langston Hughes, who was just a prolific correspondent, and there are volumes and volumes of his letters, you know, finding a Langston Hughes letter is a little bit exciting, but not that exciting. And I think for me with Harper Lee, it just meant every day that went well was that much more exciting, or every relative or friend of hers who would talk. And same thing for the Reverend. You know, he was his own kind of mysteriousness. And every time you learned something about him, or you got an actual court document, or you got an actual deposition he had taken part in, you know, facts become very precious in an economy like that. And it becomes that much more rewarding as a reporter to pursue the story. And, you know, some of those rewarding experiences really do just change the way you think about the story or about the person. And I think probably a good example of that in the book, it's another one of the photos, if you have it in front of you. There's this really striking photograph of Harper Lee and Truman Capote that was taken in 1976. And much of what we had thought about Harper Lee and Capote was that their friendship had ended right after In Cold Blood. They had not stayed in touch. You know, they'd had this huge falling out. And it was always curious to me because Harper Lee had participated in this interview with him in 1976 for People magazine, of all things. And she said very, very little. In fact, 7 of the 12 words she said on the record are the epigraph to my book: "We are bound by a common anguish." You know, this utterly inscrutable phrase, "We are bound by a common anguish." And she was talking about their childhoods, but of course she was talking about their careers and a lot of other things too. But I'd always wondered, you know, what the heck was the story of this People magazine interview? And so I looked at the reporter and I looked at the photographer for the photo shoot, and I contacted the photographer, and we got on the phone, and he starts telling me about Harper Lee and Truman Capote. And he had been a time and a life photographer, and he had gone with Capote to New Orleans, and they'd been to, you know, they'd been to strip parlors together. They'd been to gentlemen's clubs together. He had just followed Capote all around the South and covered him. And he begged him year after year after year to try to get Harper Lee to come for a photo shoot. And finally in 1976, you know, they're in Manhattan and Capote calls and Lee says, "Okay, fine, I'll come." And, you know, this photographer remembered it like it was yesterday. Here she arrives at the United Nations building. They walk down 2nd Avenue. He takes these gorgeous pictures. But what he remembered was, you know, he said it was like they were siblings, like this young, you know, just brother and sister kind of chittering with each other. You know, he said it was just like they'd never left Monroeville. Here they were at the, you know, at the end of their careers. Capote was really struggling with a substance abuse problem. They were old and pepper-haired, but for him, for the photographer, it was just this incredibly human moment, and, you know, had really made an impression on him. And I love that photograph because right away we see that for all the complexities of their relationships, they didn't fall out entirely. You know, they did actually speak, they did stay in touch, and it just changed the way I thought about their adult friendship, and made sense of her work on this case, because it's right after that meeting that she goes down to Alabama to start this true crime project. So, you know, we talk about reminiscing about the old days, but there was Harper Lee in 1976 realizing the last time she'd really been productive was out in Kansas with Capote. So again, you know, just because people don't normally talk about her just makes it all that more exciting when they do. And it means the information they deliver to you, like that photographer, really can illuminate some part of their life. So I think that, it really is, people are attracted to different kinds of things. And, someone like Ron Chernow writes great books about very well-known public figures. And part of his task is sorting through the reception of their life. Or, Casey Schiff writes extraordinary books about someone like Cleopatra, about whom there is this kind of wide cultural resonance, but very little actual concrete information. And, I think I'm somewhere in between the two. Harper Lee was interesting to me because so little was known about her. And right away, I learned what was known was inaccurate. She was not reclusive. Her time in Alexander's City demonstrates how much she loved to talk to people, how social she was, how gregarious she was. And I think the kind of biggest canard about her, she was a one-hit wonder, is just immensely complicated by this project where she might have only published the one book, but she worked on many others, and her ambition was wide and varied. So I think for me, that's, just the fun part. And I just finished this profile for the magazine. It's in last week's issue, I think, about this writer, Marilyn Robinson. And, Marilyn Robinson is an extraordinary novelist, and she's nowhere near as private as Harper Lee, but she is a devout Christian, and she writes extensively about faith and theology. But there was a similar challenge there of trying to pierce the ineffable. It is very hard to write about religion. It's very hard to talk about faith, and her novels do it wonderfully. But, there was a challenge. A lot of people had profiled Marilyn and had written about her, but I felt like the fun challenge for me was going beyond what the public already knew and piecing together her career in a new and interesting way. So I'm kind of drawn to private people and people who are misunderstood. And I'm really, really hoping, I actually just heard from, this is going to be like frustratingly tantalizing. I just heard from someone who I would love to write about, and he's not ready to be a subject. He's like kind of never been profiled, but an artist I really admire, and who, I hope after some time might be open to the possibility. But I really experience it as exciting and tantalizing. And, again, if it were easy, it would not be that interesting to me. So it's a great question. And I think that, people, again, are just drawn to different things. But I don't think if it were the kind of subject who just opened the door and poured out their heart and soul or had published their diaries, they would be that interesting to me, because the interiority would already be available to the public. And, the whole story of their life would already be available to the public. So I think some of that obscurity and opaqueness and, privacy is what's appealing to me.
And meanwhile, as you're writing about her, you come across these two other fascinating people in the Reverend Willie Maxwell and Tom Radney. I mean, I think it's incredible you can lump all three in a book. But what, as you're writing about these two, in addition to Harper Lee, and you're finding out about Reverend Maxwell, a voodoo minister murderer, and a lawyer who represents him, what struck you about them, and what did you find tantalizing? I mean, what were some takeaways from you? Like, wow, these guys are really interesting characters.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I think that I should just explain something about the structure of the book for people who haven't read it. I joke that, I never want there to be anything but truth in advertising. And it should be said that if you're interested in this book for Harper Lee, she appears on the first page, but then she kind of disappears for 2/3 of the book, and then she shows up again. And I love it because it's medic the way she was in the world. She's not talking to Oprah. She was not 100 interviews a day. She was not Truman Capote. They were childhood friends, but they had radically different theories of fame and how to be an author. So it's true that 2/3 of the book are devoted to the actual crime story that she was investigating. And it's divided across these two characters. And that structure was pretty obvious to me from the beginning, because they were, to me, every bit as interesting as she was. And, the book is incredibly democratic, I think, in the attention it pays to those other characters. That might be surprising to folks who feel like, well, obviously the world famous novelist is just more interesting and more it merits more attention, but I don't think that's true. And I think that, in fact, her life is all the more interesting when it's set against these other two characters. And in some ways, they have a lot in common. They were born within a few years of each other. All three were born in very small Alabama towns. And their lives are, shaped by incredible structural forces, by gender, by race, by socioeconomic status. I sometimes use this as an illustration. The Reverend and Tom Radney were both in the Army. And the Reverend served in World War II, got a Medal for Good Conduct, was by all accounts a very distinguished serviceman. But when he came back to Alabama, Alabama was as segregated as the Army was. And he went to work in a textile mill that had made the uniforms he wore in the service. So he came back to little opportunity, went to work in the kind of job he would have had even if he had not been in the war. When Tom Radney got done with his military service, he was enlisted in the JAG Corps, and his law studies were complete, and he had experience as a trial lawyer, and he opened a legal firm which thrived almost from the beginning. So I think that, again, for people who kind of start out in the same place, it's really interesting to look at where their lives went and the kinds of opportunities that were available to them. And same thing for Tom Radney and Harper Lee. I think that, the people from Monroeville, Alabama, were shocked by what Harper Lee was able to do. And that included her father, who just was agog that, a little girl from a small town could move to New York and become, one of the best-selling authors of all time and win the Pulitzer Prize and just change the American literary canon. It was shocking. People from Monroeville did not really do that kind of thing. Or if they did, they were Truman Capote and they were strange, and you just explained it away with its strangeness. So, I think that those three lives are only more interesting in conversation with each other. And when you think about the kind of unexpected but spectacular moment they meet. So that's why, kind of from the get-go, those other two characters were every bit as interesting to me. And by, following the Reverend's life, I could talk a lot about religion and about the life insurance fraud and about, race in Alabama, which was always on my mind and which has obviously become a much more important part of the way we talk about To Kill a Mockingbird and we think about its role in the canon. And same thing for Tom Radney. Unfortunately, the way that history winnows out stories is, winners really do get the lion's share of attention. And Tom Radney lost the lieutenant governor's race. He was run out of state politics after he endorsed Teddy Kennedy in 1968. So one of the years that Wallace was running for president, he got death threats, his family was threatened, their home was vandalized, and Tom Radney was run out of politics. And that didn't make his political ambitions any less interesting to me. And I felt like one of the things I could do was look at a character like this who had been, again, he was known as Big Tom. He was a truly famous guy, just the way the Reverend was in this part of Alabama. But just because we haven't heard of him on Cape Cod or in Maryland doesn't mean he wasn't a big deal to the people who knew him. And doesn't mean that his story can't bring to life some of the dynamics of this part of Alabama. So they were always just incredibly interesting to me. And I guess a moment where it was so clear that they were worth exploring, I remember thinking, what kind of lawyer would represent the Reverend? This guy was accused of killing 2 wives, a brother, a nephew, a stepdaughter. What kind of lawyer sticks it out? And I'm sure there are lawyers listening, and let me say it away, I believe everyone deserves a lawyer, and they're kind of straightforward, theory of the justice system, which explains it, but it still was curious to me. This guy knew everything he was accused of. And I was researching some of the life insurance litigation. And I realized that the Reverend, Tom often had to partner with other attorneys around the state because he had docket issues. So at one point he ran out of juries in Tallapoosa County because he sued these life insurance companies so much. There was basically no eligible jurors. They'd all heard the story of the Reverend Maxwell in this life insurance case or this other one. So he sometimes moved around to shop for new dockets. And one of the times he did that, he did it in Macon County, which is where Tuskegee is. And he worked with a Black lawyer named Fred Gray. And, I was curious, well, who's Fred Gray? I did not know his name at that time. And I just, started Googling Fred Gray. And Fred Gray is one of the most distinguished civil rights lawyers in Alabama history. He represented MLK. He represented Rosa Parks during the bus boycott. And lo and behold, at one point in his career, he also represented the Reverend Maxwell. And, Alabama is a small state. There were not a lot of Black lawyers at the time, but what are the odds? One of the most remarkable civil rights lawyers in this country's history also represented the Reverend Maxwell, the least likely poster boy for civil rights anyone could dream of. But Fred Gray had been trying to make an argument about life insurance companies and the way that they were gouging Black clients. And he had been looking for a case like this where he could make this argument. And there's no reason for folks to remember it, but in the 70s, life insurance worked very differently. There was a lot more variability. It's why the Reverend Maxwell could get away with this fraud. But it was also a time of real predation for African Americans. They were charged more for their policies. They were denied payment when they were due. Some of the most predatory companies continued to extract fees and costs after the point of death, when they should have been rewarding the client. They would continue to charge them fees and ongoing formal costs. So, this stuff was so bad that when these cases were finally settled in the aughts, they were settled to the tune of, $500 million. It was a tremendous amount of fraud and predation. So Fred Gray had been looking for an opportunity to bring this before a jury, and he found it with the Reverend Maxwell. So, that's just a moment where it's like, boy, this guy really does merit his own case. It's not just the voodoo, it's not just the serial killer stuff. It really is just an interesting moment in Alabama history, who he is and what he's up to, and the other people he crosses paths with.
Harper Lee died in 2016. Did you ever have a chance to interview her, to talk to her yourself? And how did you come up with the title of your book?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I did not ever get to interview Harper Lee. And one of the things that, if you look at the original story I wrote for the New Yorker, and if you look at some of the reporting that came out at the end of her life, some of the questions that were being asked were about capacity and about, her ability to consent to publication and her mental competency. And I think that, it was a very tricky time in her life. I got interested in this story right before she died. And I was able then, both in that earlier period and once she passed, to interview her closest living relatives and her extended family and some of the people who had known her throughout her life, but I was never able to interview Harper Lee herself. And I mentioned some of the correspondence in the book. So that's a lot of the book is built out from those interviews and from correspondence, all the way back to when she was in college and when she was in law school before she dropped out until the aughts. So she had a stroke in 2000 in the aughts, which really changed her life, and she had to leave New York and she moved home to an assisted living facility, and her life kind of contracted from there. So I was lucky the people I did get to talk to, but I was never able to talk to her. But the title is an example of, so much of this book, even when it's not about her, is interested in her life and is kind of always building to the question of what did she make of this case and what kind of a book would she have written about it. And the title Furious Hours comes from one of the only public lectures Harper Lee ever gave. And it was a few years into the Maxwell case. She was, for it's a complicated story that I get into in the book, but she hated public speaking. She hated talking to the public. She hated talking to the press, anything that reeked of, the author Harper Lee. But she got pushed into doing this lecture for a tiny, tiny town in Alabama, and it was where one of her sisters lived. So she goes to this History and Heritage Festival, and of course the organizers wanted her read from To Kill a Mockingbird. She wouldn't do that. She told them she would give a lecture and it would be on her favorite historian. And there's no reason for anyone to have heard of this guy, but is a historian named Pickett, and he had written kind of the first history of Alabama. And Harper Lee loved it. Her father loved it. The family, by all accounts, kind of kept it in print. No one else was reading it. It had been completely forgotten, but they loved Pickett's History of Alabama. And the lecture she gave talked about a kind of curious fact, which is that Pickett's history ends right when most people would argue Alabama's history got most interesting. So it ends in 1819 with statehood. And Harper Lee had a theory about why that was, which she thought that Pickett had become so enamored with the indigenous history of Alabama, with the Creek Indians and the tribes that were there before the settlers moved in, before the European settlers moved in. And she thought that Pickett had really put down his pen and been unable to continue because he couldn't bear to tell the story of the end of the Creek Empire. So she had this completely, almost Freudian psychological account of what Pickett had done and why his book was so good, but also why it stopped. And the thing to know about the end of the Creek Wars, when the Creek Indians were defeated, it all took place not far from where the Maxwell murders took place, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And that battlefield had just become a National Historic Park. Harper Lee liked to go and tour it when she was working on her book. She was very interested in the Creek Indians too. If you've read Mockingbird lately, you know some of what Scout and Jem are very interested in is the history of the Creeks and the kind of precursor to Alabama settlement. So this was all interesting to Harper Lee, and she said, the end of the Creek Empire, which happened, as we all know, in a few furious hours at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And then she keeps talking about Pickett. But she says that Pickett left his heart at Horseshoe Bend. Again, this completely emotional account of a historical project. And the thing to know is the motel where Harper Lee stayed when she was working on her book was called the Horseshoe Ben Motel. And I've always thought that, and I say this in the book, that when she was giving that lecture, she was talking about herself almost as much as she was talking about Pickett. And the story she told about someone who had lost their nerve and not been able to finish their project, I think was already her faltering with the Maxwell case. And for all of the enthusiasm and energy she brought to this true crime book, she was never able to publish it. And some people in her life think she was able to finish it, but quite a lot of them don't. And I kind of round up all that rumor and gossip and innuendo for you and, beat the bounds of what people think she did or didn't do. But I love that lecture, and the chapter in the book is called Horseshoe Bend, because it is just a moment where I think she really did say a lot more than even she meant to. And again, to the point of how much self-understanding or self-knowledge we have, I think that, what was happening for her was in talking about Pickett, she was able to talk about herself. And there's a kind of bookend moment at the end of my book where they were celebrating, Harper Lee's older sister lived until she was 103, and they were celebrating her 90th birthday, and they were at the state archives. And the two sisters get to go and look at, the state archives of Alabama have all of Pickett's research materials. And, there they are, these just two old women paging through Pickett's materials. And, there's Harper Lee, all these decades after she abandoned the Maxwell Project, all these decades after the kind of height of her ambition and her role as a writer in the public eye. There they are just looking through the scraps of materials. And I think it must have been very hard for her because, of course, even if it's incomplete, even if it ends when the rest of us would say it's getting started, Pickett finished his book, and he published it, and Harper Lee read it, and you and I can go and read it today. I did, to work on the book. And so I just think it's an interesting moment, and I liked it for the title because, hopefully this last hour of ours wasn't that furious, but obviously, like, the book is filled with furious hours. Her attempts to write, Tom Radney's attempts to litigate or to legislate. And of course, I think kind of from the get-go, the furious hours of the Reverend, these incredibly violent crimes that were, that he was never convicted of, that there was no real closure for. One of the reasons this case has loomed so large in this part of Alabama is there were no convictions. These events unfolded, they were mysterious and confusing and frightening. And the reason people thought that he was a voodoo priest is he was never convicted. And the police could never prove anything. And for all of their suspicions and all of their investigations, there's just a lot of unsettledness and incompletion and unfinishedness.
Well, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. Even, yes, I would have loved to have you in Falmouth live and in person, but this was great. And I mentioned at the top that the publisher is sending book plates. So if you want to get an autographed copy from Casey Sepp on Furious Hours, it's going to be sent to 8 Cousins. So even if you got a copy, but you want to get another one that it's signed, or you don't have a copy and you want to get one that's signed, it'll be available through 8 Cousins. So it's in paperback, it's in hardcover. Casey, thank you very, very much for joining us. This was great. Everybody, thank you for joining us. Continue to stay safe, and thank you all for joining. We'll see you next time. Good luck.
Thanks so much. Have a great night.